You know those moments when your whole life shifts in an instant, not because of some grand event, but because of a sentence? A single, offhand comment said too loudly, in front of too many people. That's what happened to me last Christmas. I was 28, sitting at the same dinner table I'd sat at every year since I was a kid, staring at a plate of dry turkey and lukewarm mashed potatoes, trying not to make eye contact with my father. I wasn't expecting the night to be good, but I never expected him to look around the table, laugh, and call me dead weight in front of everyone. That's not even the worst part. The worst part is that no one stopped him. My name's Zach, and I guess you could say I've always been the odd one out in my family. I'm the youngest of three. My sister Rachel is 35, and my brother Dean is 33. Growing up, our house wasn't abusive, exactly, but it was rigid, structured. My dad ran it like a CEO runs a company, and we were the unpaid interns constantly trying not to get fired. Rachel learned early how to suck up. She was the golden child, always in control, never out of place. Dean played the part of the golden boy, star athlete, dad's shadow. And me? I was the quiet one, the creative one, the one who didn't want to go into business or finance or whatever blueprint my dad had drawn up for my future before I even hit puberty. Instead, I liked art. I liked building things, sketching, designing. I got into 3D animation in high school and eventually pursued it as a career. Not exactly what my father would call real work. He never said it directly, not back then, at least, but it was obvious. He'd smile politely when I mentioned a new project, then immediately pivot the conversation to Dean's promotion or Rachel's new condo. My wins weren't wins to him. They were distractions, hobbies. And somewhere along the line, the rest of the family started treating me the same way. By the time I hit my mid-20s, I had distanced myself a lot. I still showed up for the major holidays, partly out of guilt, partly out of hope that maybe something had changed. Spoiler, it hadn't. The comments were always subtle but stacked. My mom would ask if I was still doing those little videos, like I was a teenager messing around on a laptop. Rachel would tell me I should think about getting a real job before it's too late. Dean would just laugh and say nothing, like I was a joke he didn't even need to tell. But this year was different. This year, something had shifted in me, not them. I'd actually had a huge win, a personal one. I'd finally signed a long-term contract with a major studio to work on a streaming series. It was the kind of job that paid better than anything my siblings were doing, even if I didn't wear a suit or sit in an office. It wasn't flashy or viral, so I hadn't posted about it on social media. I thought maybe I'd share the news in person. You know, let them see that I wasn't some starving artist drifting through life. I figured maybe, just maybe, they'd be proud. So I showed up to Christmas dinner feeling something I hadn't felt in years around my family. Confidence. My mom greeted me at the door with her usual tight hug, and that look that screamed, "I was worried you wouldn't come." Dean barely looked up from his phone. Rachel gave me the air kiss she reserved for people she didn't want to wrinkle her makeup for. My dad didn't even come to the door. He was already seated at the table with a glass of scotch and the look of a man who thought he was doing us all a favor just by showing up. The dinner started like they always do. My mom asked if I was dating anyone. I wasn't. Dean talked about crypto. Rachel brought her boyfriend, Carter, who may as well have been a mirror of my dad in a slightly younger body, and the two of them immediately launched into a conversation about real estate. No one asked about me. Not once. I waited. I thought maybe after dessert I'd bring it up. Maybe when things had calmed down and people were less performative. But then my dad cleared his throat and raised his glass for a toast, and everything went sideways. "I just want to say," he began, "how proud I am of my kids. Rachel just closed her biggest deal yet. Dean's company is expanding, and it's great to see hard work pay off." He paused, smirking, looking around the table. Then he added, "And Zach's here too, still floating along. Dead weight, but we love him." It was said like a joke, the kind of thing you're supposed to laugh at to make it less sharp. But no one laughed. Not really. Rachel gave a polite chuckle. Dean snorted. My mom froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Carter grinned like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. And I just sat there. I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't even flinch. I just let it sit. Let them all marinate in the moment they didn't expect to matter. Because that's what they'd always done. Say cruel things and expect you to play along. Laugh it off, swallow it whole. But this time, I wasn't going to. Instead, I asked one question. A single sentence that I swear made the air leave the room. My mom dropped her fork. Rachel's smile cracked. Dean actually looked up from his phone for the first time all night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just looked at my father and asked the one thing none of them were ready for. I didn't even raise my voice. Just looked my father straight in the eye, leaned back in my chair, and asked, "Who paid the mortgage in 2009 when you got laid off?" The reaction was immediate. My mother's fork clattered to her plate. Rachel froze, mid-sip of wine, her glass hovering in the air like a freeze frame from a sitcom. Dean's head jerked up like someone had slapped him. My father blinked. Once. Then again. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the dishwasher running in the kitchen and the soft Christmas jazz spilling from the Bluetooth speaker in the living room. No one said a word. See, they all remembered 2009. It was one of the worst years for our family, financially. My dad got laid off from his managerial job at a regional supply company, and my mom's part-time work as a paralegal wasn't enough to keep the bills paid. Rachel was still in grad school at the time, fully funded by my parents, of course. Dean had just started working at a tech startup, but he was barely making rent. No one in the family had money to spare. No one except me. At the time, I was 21, a junior in college, and I'd just sold the rights to a short animated film I'd made during an internship. It didn't go viral or make headlines, but it got picked up by an indie platform for a licensing fee that, for me, felt like winning the lottery. I wasn't rich, not by any means, but I had enough to help. So I did, quietly, without fanfare, without asking for anything in return. I wrote checks when the mortgage was late, covered the electricity bills, paid for groceries. My name wasn't on any documents. My dad never acknowledged it out loud, but they all knew. And now, years later, with his scotch glass raised and his smug grin in place, he called me dead weight, in front of the people who should have known better. I didn't need to say anything else. The question alone was enough to fracture something in that perfectly controlled narrative my father liked to keep tight-fisted over our family. He tried to recover, cleared his throat. "That was years ago," he said gruffly, like that somehow erased it. "You were just trying to help." "Yeah," I said. "Because you asked." He flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. So did everyone else. And I think that's when the balance in the room shifted, like the floor had tilted just a few degrees, and no one was sure where to put their feet. The conversation stuttered back to life after that, but the energy had changed. My mom barely touched her food. Rachel suddenly became very interested in her phone. Dean kept giving me sidelong glances like I'd grown a second head. No one asked about my work. No one congratulated me on my success, because at that point, it was obvious I'd come into that house with something they didn't expect, leverage. But I didn't press it. I let the silence do the work for me. Sometimes, truth lands heavier when you don't shove it down people's throats. The rest of dinner passed in a weird daze. After dessert, I helped my mom clear the table. She was quiet, her mouth tight, but her hands were trembling. As I handed her a stack of plates, she whispered, "You shouldn't have said that in front of everyone." I looked at her. Said what? The truth. Her eyes flicked to the dining room. "You know how your father is." "Yeah," I said. "That's the problem." She didn't respond. Just took the plates and turned toward the kitchen. After that night, things got colder. Over the next few weeks, I got fewer texts from my mom. No calls. Rachel unfollowed me on Instagram, which was her digital way of slamming a door. Dean sent me one half-hearted message asking if I was okay, but when I replied with a simple, "Doing better than ever," he never answered. Then came Easter. By then, I'd mostly moved on. I wasn't expecting an apology, but I also wasn't expecting what came next. I showed up because, despite everything, I still wanted to give them a chance. I guess I still believed in the idea of family, even if it kept letting me down. When I arrived, it was obvious I wasn't really welcome. No one had saved me a seat. There was no plate set for me. My mom blinked in surprise like she hadn't expected me to come. Rachel and Dean were already deep in conversation with my dad, all of them sipping wine and laughing about something that stopped the moment I walked in. My mom quickly grabbed a spare chair and muttered, "Oh, we didn't think you were coming." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked. She didn't answer. I sat at the edge of the table like an afterthought, trying to stay civil, trying to ignore the weird tension. But it didn't take long for the conversation to turn against me, again. "So, Zach," Rachel said, her voice a shade too bright. "Still playing around with cartoons?" I smiled. "Still animating, yeah?" working on a couple episodes for a new series. Oh, that's nice, she said, like I'd told her I was working at a smoothie shop. Must be nice not to have to worry about the real world. I blinked. You mean paying rent and bills and taxes? She waved it off. You know what I mean. And just like that, it was happening again. Same script, different holiday. Dean joined in this time, saying something about freelancers being allergic to real structure. My dad laughed. My mom said nothing. And I realized, for the first time, that they weren't going to change. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't have to. Because they had each other. And I didn't. Then the real blow came. My dad clinked his glass and announced that Rachel and Carter were expecting a baby. Everyone gasped and celebrated. Hugs, cheers, tears. I smiled, congratulated her, genuinely happy for her. And then she said, "We're thinking of naming him after Dad. Or maybe Dean. You know, strong names." And my mom, my own mother, added with a chuckle, "Well, at least we know this baby won't end up living in fantasy land." They all laughed, loud and long. No one looked at me. No one cared how it landed. That's when I realized this wasn't just about respect. This was about erasure. They wanted to pretend I was never the one who held them up when they were sinking. They wanted to rewrite the past so they could keep justifying their version of who I was, the soft one, the dreamer, the useless one. But they'd gone too far. A few days later, I got a text from my mom. She said she was planning a surprise party for my dad's 60th birthday that summer and hoped I could put together one of your little videos as a gift. I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because of how casually cruel it was. That's when the idea hit me. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of something colder, sharper. If they wanted to rewrite history, fine. I'd let them. But I'd write the ending. Because here's the thing they didn't know. I wasn't just some freelance artist anymore. I had access to tools they couldn't even pronounce. I had time, skill, and receipts. I had emails, screenshots, old checks, and most importantly, I had the full, unvarnished truth. So I smiled, texted my mom back, and said, "I'd love to help with that. I'll make it something he'll never forget." And I meant it. I didn't respond to that text right away. I told myself I needed time to plan the video, but really, I just needed space to breathe, to think, to make sure I wasn't acting out of pure emotion. Because for a while, that's all I was, angry. I mean, how could I not be? They erased me. I sat there for a long time after that Easter dinner, just scrolling through photos on my phone. Pictures from years back, old family barbecues, birthdays, school ceremonies. In every single one, I was off to the side. Not smiling, not frowning. Just there. Like an afterthought. Like a prop someone forgot to move out of the shot. And the more I looked, the more I realized I'd spent most of my life shrinking myself to fit into the space they'd carved out for me. A role they never intended to be big enough for who I actually was. But that role, I was done playing it. I didn't explode. Didn't send a dramatic text or make a public announcement. I didn't even call my mom back. I just stepped away. Quietly. Intentionally. And for the first time in my life, I stopped asking what they thought of me. Stopped waiting for their approval like it was some kind of prize I hadn't yet earned. And that was the beginning. The next few months were weird. Lonely, in some ways. Freeing, in others. I stopped replying to the family group chat. Stopped checking Instagram to see if Rachel had relented and followed me back. She hadn't. When my mom sent occasional "hope you're doing okay" messages, I kept my replies brief, polite, distant. She noticed. Eventually, the messages slowed to a trickle. But while my ties to them loosened, I started anchoring myself to something else. My work. That animation contract I mentioned? It blew up, in a good way. I poured everything I had into it. Late nights, early mornings, weekends spent refining keyframes and building out emotional beats for characters that, ironically, felt more real to me than the people I shared a last name with. My work became my therapy. Every scene I completed felt like I was gluing back pieces of myself that had been chipped away for years. And people noticed. The show launched on a major platform. Critics called it visually stunning and emotionally resonant. A clip from one of the episodes went viral on TikTok, and suddenly I was being flooded with messages. People telling me how much the story meant to them, how much the characters reminded them of themselves. One person wrote, "It's like you crawled inside my head and animated my childhood." That hit me hard. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just seen, I was understood. Not by my family, Not by people I'd known since I was 5, but by strangers. Strangers who didn't care what school I went to or whether I wore a suit. They only cared about what I made, what I gave the world. And that was enough. I got invited to speak on a panel at a major animation expo that summer. Flew out to LA, stayed in a decent hotel for once instead of crashing on a friend's couch. I stood on a stage with creators I'd admired since high school and talked about visual storytelling and using trauma as a lens for art. The moderator asked me what inspired the emotional tone of the show. I said, family, and left it at that. But even as things were going well, I'd be lying if I said I never thought about them. About my dad's face when I asked that question. About my mom, looking down at her plate like she wanted to disappear. About the weird, empty feeling of knowing that my success meant nothing to the people who should have cared most. There were moments, quiet ones, between edits or before bed, where the doubt crept in. Where I wondered if I was being petty. If I was the one turning cold. If maybe I'd misunderstood things all along. But then I'd remember the dinner. The laugh. The way my mom had said, at least this baby won't end up in fantasy land. Like my entire existence was a joke to her. And that would snap me out of it. They hadn't just dismissed my work. They'd dismissed me. Over and over again. So I kept building. With the success of the show, I started getting offers. Bigger projects. Feature-length gigs. Even a few requests from studios I dreamed about working with. I signed with a rep, got legal advice, built a team. Suddenly, I wasn't just doing little videos. I was running my own small production studio. I hired 2 assistants, contracted a few freelancers, started mentoring a kid from my hometown who reminded me of myself at 16. And the best part? I didn't tell my family any of it. Let them think I was still tinkering in my bedroom like a bored teenager. Let them keep underestimating me. That was the best camouflage I could ask for. Until the text came in. Late June. My mom. Hey Zach. Just a reminder about Dad's surprise 60th, July 15th. Hope you're still working on that little video. Let me know if you need help with photos. I stared at it for a long time. Smiled. Set my phone down. And opened a folder I'd been quietly building for months. See, when I'd agreed to make that video, I already knew what I was going to do. But I didn't want it to be a petty gotcha moment. I wanted it to mean something. To land with enough weight that no one could shrug it off as a tantrum. I wanted to hold a mirror up to my family and let them see exactly who they were, who they'd been all along, without me needing to say a single word. So I went back through old footage. Home videos, birthday tapes, random clips my mom had sent over the years. I pulled everything into my editing software and started weaving a narrative. Not of my dad's accomplishments or his 60 years of wisdom, but of the people around him, of the sacrifices made, of the moments they ignored. I found a clip from 2009. My mom, sitting on the porch with a worried look on her face. My voice, off camera, saying, "It's okay, Mom. I already sent the check." Another clip from Rachel's graduation, where my dad is going on and on about how proud he is of her, and you can barely hear my voice in the background, saying, "I think I got into that summer program." Ignored, overlooked, forgotten. And then there were the photos. Pictures where I was always slightly out of frame. Where Dean was center stage, Rachel smiling perfectly, and I was blurred in the background, holding the camera or half-cropped out entirely. I stitched them all together, layered them with a subtle score. Let the visuals do the talking. And then, just once, I included a caption. Not all weight is dead. Some of it carries the family when no one else can. That was it. No voiceover. No explanation. Just the images, the music, and that one line. I exported the final version the night before the party. And then, for the first time in years, I bought a proper suit. Not for them. For me. I wanted to walk into that house knowing exactly who I was. And I did. The party was at my parents' place, of course. Catered, fancy, full of people who knew my father as a pillar of the community. Rachel was there in a designer dress. Dean stood by the bar, already nursing a beer. My mom gave me the tight-lipped smile she always used when she wasn't sure how to feel. My dad, holding cord in the middle of the room, looked me over like I was just another guest, then nodded and said, "Glad you made it." I smiled. Wouldn't miss it. No one asked about the video. No one ever asks until they realize they should have. And when it finally played, on a giant screen in the living room, lights dimmed, every guest's eyes on it. The silence that fell over that room was thicker than anything I'd felt before. You could have heard a pin drop. My dad's smile disappeared. My mom looked like she'd seen a ghost. Rachel's jaw clenched. Dean? For once, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. And I just stood in the back of the room, hands in my pockets, watching it all. There's a moment that comes after the silence, after a truth is laid bare, and there's no comfortable lie left to cling to. When people reveal who they really are. The video ended. The room sat frozen. No one clapped. No one moved. It was Rachel who broke the silence first. That wasn't really appropriate, she said, voice tight, carefully measured, like she was trying to hold on to her composure with both hands. This was supposed to be a celebration. I didn't respond to her directly. I looked at my father. He was still staring at the screen, at the final frame. That one line glowing white against the black background. Not all weight is dead. Some of it carries the family when no one else can. The irony wasn't lost on me. How quickly their tone had shifted now that everyone else saw it. Not just me. Not just some angry son or black sheep with a chip on his shoulder. No, now the audience knew. His colleagues. His golf buddies. The family friends who'd always assumed I was the quiet one, who didn't come around much. Truth changes things when you force people to look at it. Still, I kept my face calm. Collected. I wasn't about to blow everything I'd built by turning this into a fight. No, this was the beginning of something much more deliberate. So I smiled. You asked me to make a video that meant something. That's what I did. My mom was pale. She stepped forward like she wanted to say something, then stopped. Her hand fluttered at her chest. Zachary, you could have warned us. I think you've had enough warnings, I said. You just never listened. And then I left. Walked right out, cool as ice, leaving them to stew in that room full of their own reflections. Because this wasn't the revenge. Not yet. That was just the setup. The part where the walls start to close in and they finally realize they're not the ones holding the map. In the days that followed, I expected someone, anyone, to call. Maybe to yell. Maybe to apologize. I was ready for both. But the silence stretched on, which only told me one thing. They weren't sure how to respond. And when people don't know how to fight back, that's when they're most vulnerable. So I started planning. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Because I had something they'd never had when dealing with me. The element of control. And I was going to use it. First step, gather the receipts. Not just from 2009, but everything. I went back through my bank records. Found the exact amounts I'd sent during that year and the few that followed. I printed screenshots of every transfer. Labeled them. Dated them. I pulled emails my mother had sent thanking me privately for keeping them afloat. I saved voice messages where she'd whispered, "Please don't tell your father I asked." I wasn't planning to sue them or anything dramatic like that. But this wasn't about money. It was about accountability. I wanted to build a record so complete, so airtight, that if any of them ever tried to rewrite history again, I'd have more than just a well-edited video. I'd have evidence. Second step, identify pressure points. Every person in that family had a weakness, and I knew them all. Rachel cared about image more than oxygen. Her LinkedIn, her Instagram, her real estate branding, everything painted her as a self-made powerhouse who came from a loving, supportive family. Her followers saw brunches, luxury condos, expensive shoes. They didn't see the ugly truths. The way she'd manipulated my parents into co-signing her first mortgage while belittling me for needing help with a car loan. The way she'd badmouthed me to clients because my weird animation stuff was a little too alternative. Dean was quieter, more subtle, but he was desperate for validation. He was always trying to impress Dad, even now in his 30s. His biggest fear? Looking small, weak, like he wasn't the guy Dad bragged about at the golf course. And he had secrets too, things I wasn't even supposed to know. And then there was my father. The man who had spent decades carefully curating his image as a respected professional and head of a tight-knit family. His whole reputation rested on that illusion. And if there's one thing my father couldn't stand, it was the idea of being seen as anything less than in control. But here's the thing. When you treat your own child like a disappointment long enough, eventually, they stop protecting you. So I made a list. Not of things to destroy, just truths to reveal. Third step, gather allies. Now this part surprised even me. I didn't think I had any. But word spreads. People talk. That video had been shared more times than I expected. One of Rachel's former friends, a woman named Camilla, DM'd me a few days after the party. She said, "It was brave what you did. I've known your sister a long time." She's never given you the credit you deserve. We met for coffee. She shared stories, little things Rachel had said over the years. How she'd made fun of me to clients. How she referred to me as the family wild card, like I was some unstable experiment. I thanked her, and we kept in touch. A few days later, I got a message from one of Dean's old friends from college. He told me about a project they'd worked on years ago, something Dean had taken credit for but hadn't actually done. It wasn't illegal or anything, but it was enough to shake the image Dean had built. I kept collecting, quietly, patiently, and as I did, something started happening. People started seeing me, really seeing me. Not the version of me my family had shaped in their stories, but the real one. The one who didn't need their approval anymore. I was invited to speak at a university panel about breaking into animation from unconventional backgrounds. I accepted. Afterward, a student came up to me and said, "I didn't think people like me could make it in this industry. Now I do." It nearly broke me. Because that was the point. That was why I'd held on so long. Why I hadn't burned the bridge completely. Because I kept hoping, maybe someone in that family would see me the way this stranger did. But they hadn't. And they wouldn't. So I kept moving. Fourth step, give them rope. Now that I was no longer protecting them, I leaned into their stories. I let them talk. When people asked me how things were with my family, I said, "You should ask them." When people asked Rachel about the birthday party video, she fumbled, deflected, said things like, "Zach's always been emotional." Which, of course, just made people more curious. And the more curious people got, the more the cracks started to show. Rachel lost a client. A big one. Turns out, that client had seen the video, asked questions, didn't like the way she answered. Image matters in her world, and she couldn't spin this one fast enough. Dean? He tried to go radio silent. But in a small enough network, silence is suspicious. He pulled out of a startup project he'd been working on. Word got around that he'd misrepresented his contributions on a previous venture. Nothing illegal, just disappointing. And my father? He started asking questions. First through my mom, texts like, "Dad wants to talk. Can you give him a call?" Then directly, "Zach, enough with the drama. Let's sit down. Clear the air." I didn't respond, because I knew exactly what that message meant. It didn't mean he wanted to apologize. It meant he wanted to regain control, to clean the mess up before it spread any further. But it was already spreading, and I wasn't done. Not yet. The final step of the setup was simple: create the opportunity. Which came, ironically, because of Rachel. She was throwing a charity gala in late September. Big venue, bigger guest list. I got an invite through Camilla. Apparently, Rachel didn't realize we'd become friends. I RSVP'd yes. When the night arrived, I wore a black suit. Same calm smile, same quiet confidence, and tucked under my arm, a manila folder. The charity gala was every bit the glittering, pretentious spectacle I expected it to be. Rachel always had a flair for turning things into branding opportunities, and this night was no exception. Sleek banners with her logo, gold accents on everything from the centerpieces to the ice cubes, and a photographer stationed right by the entrance, snapping pictures of guests as they walked in like it was the Met Gala. The event was meant to raise money for a children's hospital. Noble cause. But Rachel wasn't doing it for the kids. She was doing it for the optics, for the social media posts, for the string of hashtags she'd no doubt prepared days in advance. I stepped into that ballroom with the manila folder tucked casually under my arm and a smile I couldn't quite suppress. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about closure. Everything that was about to happen had been set in motion long ago. It just needed a gentle nudge. And tonight, I was that nudge. Camilla met me near the back of the room, just as she'd promised. She looked sharp and elegant in a navy dress, holding a glass of champagne and watching the crowd like a hawk. "She's over there," she murmured, tilting her head toward the podium. Just finished her speech. Everyone clapped. No one listened. I nodded. Perfect. I didn't approach Rachel right away. I waited, mingled, made small talk with a few people I recognized from online circles. Producers, writers, an exec from a streaming service that had reached out to me last month. It was funny. These were the kinds of people my father would have fallen over himself to impress, the kind Rachel was always trying to attract. And they knew me, not as the other sibling, not as the artsy one, but as Zach Hayden, the guy who'd built something on his own name. Eventually, Rachel spotted me. Her smile was the kind of thing you learn in expensive etiquette classes, perfectly proportioned, utterly hollow. "Zach," she said, gliding toward me in heels that probably cost more than my flight. "You came." I matched her smile. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it. You've always had a knack for throwing a party." She tilted her head, searching my face for sarcasm. "I'm glad. Really. Look, I've been meaning to talk to you. About the video. It caught us off guard. But maybe we should sit down. Clear the air." There it was again. That phrase. Clear the air. Code for, let's rewrite the story again. Only this time, keep your mouth shut. I didn't answer right away. Just glanced around at the room, at all the polished faces pretending to care about the cause, while eyeing the open bar. And then I handed her the folder. "What's this?" she asked, brows narrowing. "Something for your records," I said. "Go ahead. Open it." She frowned but peeled it open. Her eyes moved across the first page, and then froze. Her mouth parted slightly. A slow inhale. Then another. The blood drained from her face. Inside were printouts of every payment I'd ever made to our parents. The mortgage checks, the bills, screenshots of emails, texts, voice message transcripts. And on top of it all, a signed letter from our father, back when he was desperate enough to ask for help in writing. "Zach, we'll pay you back. You're not just helping us, you're saving us. I know we've been hard on you, but I promise we'll never forget this." I watched the emotions flicker through her, confusion, recognition, and finally, panic. She glanced up at me, voice low and sharp. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to remember something," I said. "You've built this brand on the idea that you come from a strong, supportive family. You've used that narrative to attract clients, partners, sympathy. But it's fiction. You've spent years diminishing me, mocking me, rewriting our history so that you're always the shining one. But the truth." I leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "The truth has teeth." She was breathing fast now. "If this is some kind of threat." "It's not," I said calmly. "It's a favor. A chance for you to stop before I decide to go public." She went rigid. "You wouldn't dare." "I don't need to," I replied. "The damage is already done. People saw that video. They're already asking questions. And if I decide to release this..." I tapped the folder. "Your whole image collapses. I'm not here to ruin you, Rachel. I'm here to tell you that from now on, you don't get to speak for me. You don't get to use me. You don't get to erase me." She didn't respond. Just stared, jaw clenched. I left her standing there and walked away. I didn't stop at Rachel, though. The next morning, I paid a quiet visit to Dean's office. Not a meeting, just a delivery. I left a small envelope with his receptionist, addressed in my handwriting. Inside were a few friendly words and a copy of a message I'd received from his old business partner, the one who'd confided that Dean had taken credit for his work years ago. The envelope included a note. "I've kept this private. I hope you'll do the same, moving forward. You've spent a long time acting like I was beneath you. Let's not pretend anymore." He never replied. And then there was my father. That conversation took place over coffee. Not at my parents' house, neutral ground. A small cafe on a quiet street. He showed up wearing that same guarded expression he always had when he knew he wasn't in control. He looked older, tired. Maybe it was the lighting. Maybe it was just finally seeing him as he was, not how I wanted him to be. He sat across from me, cleared his throat, and said, "You made your point." "No," I said. "I made my peace. Whether you understand it or not, that's up to you." He looked at me for a long time. "You think I was a bad father. I think you were a proud one. And pride can make people blind." He nodded, slowly. "You know, when you were a kid, I didn't understand you. Still don't most days." "That's not the problem," I said. "The problem is, you never tried." Silence stretched between us. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "Thank you. For the mortgage. For everything." I didn't say you're welcome. I didn't smile. I just nodded. That was enough. Weeks passed. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was quiet, slow, like erosion. Rachel's reputation took a subtle hit. Nothing dramatic, but enough that some clients stopped returning her calls. She posted less frequently. Dean stopped showing up at industry mixers. My mother texted now and then, short messages. I responded politely, but without warmth. They were still a family, still orbiting around one another. But I no longer orbited them. Instead, I focused on the life I'd built. My studio grew. I signed a deal to co-produce a new animated film. I hired Camilla as our community outreach lead. I bought a condo overlooking the river, nothing flashy, but mine. One afternoon, I walked into a bookstore and saw a hardcover collection of essays on animation and storytelling. My name was listed in the table of contents. I flipped to my piece and read the first line. Sometimes, the best stories aren't about revenge. They're about remembering who you are when the people who raised you try to make you forget. I bought 2 copies, one for myself, and one I left, and signed, unwrapped, on my parents' doorstep. No note, no explanation. They'd know. And as I walked away, I realized something. This was never about revenge. It was about release. I wasn't dead weight. I was the one who learned to carry himself when no one else would. And I never looked back. The night I realized my parents had already decided who mattered more, I was sitting in my childhood bedroom at 32 years old, staring at a ceiling fan that still made the same faint clicking noise it did when I was a teenager. It was almost comforting, in a sad way. The same room, the same noise, different version of me, broke, unemployed, and apparently expected to just bounce back on command. My name's Brian. I'm 32. And this whole thing started with a single sentence my dad said over speakerphone, like it was nothing, like it wasn't going to quietly rearrange the way I saw my family forever. I'd lost my job 2 weeks earlier. Not fired for doing something wrong, not laid off because the company collapsed overnight. It was worse than that, because it was quieter. Restructuring, new leadership. My role no longer aligned with the company's direction. I'd read the email 3 times before it actually sank in. I remember staring at my laptop after the call ended, half expecting another message to pop up saying there'd been a mistake. There wasn't. Just silence. And then the very real awareness that rent was still due, groceries still cost money, and health insurance didn't care about my feelings. I didn't call my parents right away. Pride mostly. I'd always been the independent one. Not in the way they bragged about, but in the way that meant I didn't ask for much. I moved out early, paid my own way through most of college, took whatever job I could get afterward, and worked my way up slowly. No drama. No big requests. My younger brother, Mark, was the opposite. He was loud, impulsive, always in some kind of financial mess that everyone else seemed to rally around. They called him spirited. I called him exhausting. But somehow, his problems were always urgent, and mine were always manageable. When I finally did call my parents, it was after I'd run the numbers 6 different times and realized I had maybe 2 months before things got ugly. I tried to sound calm, casual, like this was just a temporary hiccup. My mom listened quietly while I explained what happened. My dad cleared his throat a few times in that way he does when he's already forming a response and not really hearing the rest. Well, he said, after a pause that felt just a little too long, you're smart. You'll bounce back. That was it. No follow-up questions. No offer to help with rent for a month. No, do you need groceries? Or do you want to stay with us for a bit? Just confidence. The kind that costs them nothing. I laughed, because what else do you do when the people who raised you reduce your crisis to a motivational poster? I said something like, yeah, I hope so. We talked for a few more minutes about job boards and how the market's weird right now. And then my mom told me to keep my chin up. When we hung up, I sat there holding my phone, feeling smaller than I had in a long time. A week later, Mark called me, not to ask how I was doing. He never really did that. He wanted to complain about interest rates. He'd racked up a mix of credit card debt and some kind of personal loan I didn't fully understand, all tied to a business idea he'd dropped 6 months earlier. He laughed about it like it was all temporary, like it always was. Don't worry, he said, cheerful as ever. Mom and Dad are helping me straighten it out. That should have been my first real warning, but I brushed it off. Parents help their kids. I told myself it wasn't a competition, that my situation was different, that I was older, more capable, that needing help didn't mean I deserved it more. Still, little things started to add up. Family group chats where my job search was met with thumbs-up reactions, while Mark's latest scheme got paragraphs of encouragement. Sunday dinners where my mom asked if I'd heard back from anyone yet, in that careful voice people use when they're already preparing for disappointment. Meanwhile, Mark talked freely about plans, trips, ideas that all required money he definitely did not have. 2 months passed like that. 2 months of rejections, interviews that went nowhere, savings draining faster than I wanted to admit. I took freelance work. I sold things I didn't need. I learned exactly how many days I could stretch a bag of rice and a pack of chicken thighs. I didn't tell my parents how bad it was getting. Part of me wanted to see how long it would take before they noticed on their own. They didn't. The moment everything shifted was a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. My mom had insisted I come over for dinner, saying it would be good to get out of the apartment. I showed up tired, thinner than usual, trying to look normal. Halfway through the meal, my dad raised his glass like he had an announcement. "We finally did it," he said, smiling. "Paid off Mark's debts. All of them." My mom beamed. Mark leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, like he'd personally achieved something remarkable. They talked about it openly, proudly. The numbers. The relief. How good it felt to get him back on track. No one looked at me. I sat there, fork paused halfway to my mouth, doing the math in my head. The same parents who told me I'd bounce back had just written a check big enough to erase my brother's mistakes. The same parents who hadn't offered me a single month of help were celebrating a rescue mission they never once questioned. I smiled. I even congratulated Mark. What else could I do? But something in me went very quiet in that moment. Not angry. Not yet. Just clear. They were right about one thing. I was going to bounce back. Just not in the way they expected. I didn't say anything that night. I went home, lay awake in the dark, and replayed the dinner over and over. Every word. Every laugh. Every casual assumption that I'd be fine, because I always was. And somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, a thought settled in that felt uncomfortable but honest. If they were never going to see me as someone worth stepping in for, then I needed to stop acting like I was waiting for them to. The next morning, I made a decision. A small one, at first. Then another. And another. Each one felt like stacking kindling. Quietly. Carefully. No big speeches. No confrontations. Just preparation. Because I was done asking for help from people who only offered it when it made them feel like heroes. I didn't confront them after that dinner. I didn't send a long message or make a dramatic exit. On the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up to family events. I still answered calls. I still played my role. But internally, something had shifted. I stopped explaining myself. Stopped offering updates and less asked directly. I told myself I was conserving energy, but the truth was simpler. I was watching. The weeks after that dinner were some of the heaviest I've ever lived through. The job market stayed cold. Interviews came and went. Some companies ghosted me after 3 rounds like I'd never existed. Others sent polite rejection emails that all sounded the same, just different logos at the top. I woke up every morning with that familiar weight in my chest, the one that sits there for a few seconds before you even remember why it's there. I tracked every dollar. I skipped meals more often than I should have. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was still capable. I just needed time. My parents, meanwhile, seemed lighter than ever. Helping Mark had energized them. Every phone call somehow circled back to him. How relieved he was. How motivated. How this fresh start was exactly what he needed. They spoke like they'd invested wisely, like they'd backed the right horse and were already seeing returns. One afternoon, my mom called me while I was sitting in my car, parked outside a coffee shop I couldn't really afford but needed for the Wi-Fi. She asked how things were going. I hesitated, just for a second, before answering honestly. "Still looking," I said. "It's been rough." She hummed sympathetically. "Well, you know, these things happen for a reason." I waited. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't ask how I was managing. Instead, she shifted gears. "By the way," she said, casual, "Mark's thinking about moving closer to us. He's talking about starting something new." I stared at the dashboard, fingers tight around my phone. "That's great," I said. "We might help him with a deposit," she added, "just to make sure he lands on his feet." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said nothing, and she filled the silence with reassurance meant for herself. "It's different with you, Brian. You've always been so self-sufficient." There it was. The compliment that felt like a sentence. That night, I checked my bank account again and realized I had exactly 26 days before rent became a real problem. I considered calling my parents back. Really calling. Laying it all out. Telling them I wasn't okay. That I needed help. That their confidence in my resilience was starting to feel less like faith and more like neglect. I didn't make the call. Part of me wanted to see just how far they'd let it go. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in layers. Small, cutting moments that stacked on top of each other until something finally cracked. It started with my dad asking me to help Mark. We were all at my parents' house again, this time for my mom's birthday. Cake, coffee, the usual. Mark was talking animatedly about his new direction, waving his fork around like a presentation pointer. My dad turned to me mid-conversation. "Hey, Brian," he said. "You're good with numbers. Think you could help Mark put together a budget? Just to keep him on track." I blinked. "A budget?" "Yeah," my dad said. "Since he's starting fresh." I wanted to ask which part of my situation screamed financial advisor. I wanted to ask if anyone remembered that I was unemployed. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Sure," I said. "I can look at it." Mark grinned. "See? I told you he'd help." That night, Mark emailed me his numbers. Seeing them laid out like that felt surreal. The debts my parents had wiped. The cushion he now had. The monthly expenses that were, somehow, higher than mine had ever been even when I was employed. At the bottom of the spreadsheet was a note. "Mom and Dad said you'd know what to do." I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. It felt like a joke I was the only one not laughing at. A few days later, my mom asked if I could dog sit while they went away for a weekend. "Just 2 nights," she said. "You don't have much going on right now, right?" That one landed harder than it should have. Not because of the request, but because of how casually my situation was minimized. Like unemployment had turned me into a placeholder. Someone with unlimited availability and no real obligations. I agreed. Again, the real betrayal, the one that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, came 2 weeks after that. I got an email from my landlord titled Notice. My heart dropped before I even opened it. It wasn't an eviction notice yet, but it was close enough to make my hands shake. I needed help. Not advice. Not encouragement. Actual help. So I called my parents. I didn't sugarcoat it this time. I told them where I was at. I told them about the notice. I told them I needed short-term support, just until I got back on my feet. I could hear my own voice shaking, and I hated that it was happening, but I pushed through it. There was a pause on the line. Too long. My dad finally spoke. "Well, Brian, we've already stretched ourselves thin helping Mark." My mom chimed in quickly. "We didn't realize things were that tight for you, but you're resourceful. You always figure it out." I felt something inside me give way. "So that's it?" I asked. "You can't help me at all?" "It's not that we can't," my dad said. "It's just not the right time." Not the right time. I thanked them for listening and hung up before my voice could betray me any further. 2 days later, I found out what "not the right time" really meant. Mark called me excited. Too excited. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Mom and Dad just paid the first 6 months of my rent up front. Said it would give me breathing room." I sat down on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding. 6 months, I repeated. "Yeah, they said they didn't want me stressing about money while I got my footing back." I didn't respond right away. Mark, oblivious as ever, kept talking about furniture and plans and how lucky he felt. When the call ended, I just sat there. The contrast was so stark it almost felt intentional. The timing, the choice. They hadn't just said no to me. They'd chosen him again, immediately after. That was the moment everything crystallized. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't ignorance. It was a pattern, one they were comfortable with, one they expected me to accept quietly, like I always had. I stood up, walked over to my closet, and started pulling out old boxes I hadn't touched in years. Documents, notes, things I'd saved without really knowing why. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for leverage. And as I sorted through those boxes, one memory surfaced that made my hands stop moving entirely. A conversation from years ago. A promise made casually. Something my parents had assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I sat there on the floor, surrounded by papers, feeling a strange mix of hurt and clarity. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect. About being invisible until I was useful. And for the first time since I'd lost my job, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the next month. I was thinking about how far this went. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There's no single crash, no cinematic moment where everything shatters at once. It's quieter than that. It's a slow erosion, a series of small losses that pile up until you wake up one morning and realize the version of yourself you used to be feels very far away. For me, rock bottom arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Mark told me about the 6 months of rent my parents had paid for him. I woke up to an email from my landlord asking if I'd had a chance to review the notice. The polite tone somehow made it worse. Like he was giving me space to pretend this wasn't serious yet. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. the one that made breathing feel shallow. I did the math again, even though I already knew the answer wouldn't change. I didn't have enough. I spent that day walking, not toward anything in particular, just moving, because sitting still felt unbearable. I passed places I used to go without thinking, cafes I'd worked out of, stores I'd browsed on lunch breaks back when I had a lunch break. Everything looked the same, which somehow made it feel worse. Like the world hadn't noticed I was falling behind. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to regularly since college. Not to ask for money, just to talk. I didn't even tell him everything. I just said I was having a rough time. He listened, didn't rush to fix it, didn't minimize it. When we hung up, I realized how starved I'd been for that simple validation. The next week was brutal. I sold more things I actually cared about this time. I cut expenses down to almost nothing. I stopped pretending I was between jobs and started admitting to myself that I was struggling. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Once I stopped lying to myself, I could actually think clearly. I didn't tell my parents any of this. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. I already knew how that conversation would go. Encouragement without assistance. Pride without presence. I couldn't afford that kind of disappointment anymore. The lowest moment came late one night when I was packing up more boxes, trying to decide what I could sell next. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by half-filled boxes, and felt completely hollow. Not sad, not angry, just empty, like I'd been drained of whatever kept me going before. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if I stayed in that space too long, it would swallow me. So I did something small, something almost stupidly simple. I opened my laptop and made a list. Not of jobs I wanted, but of things I could actually do right now. Skills I had, experience I'd overlooked, connections I'd been too proud to reach out to. The list wasn't impressive at first. It didn't magically fix anything, but it was real. It was mine. And for the first time in weeks, it gave me something to focus on that wasn't just survival. I started reaching out. Quietly. No announcements. No social media posts about exciting new chapters. I sent emails to former coworkers, old clients, people I hadn't talked to in years. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for conversations, advice, temporary work, anything. Some never replied. Some did. One conversation turned into a small freelance project. That project paid less than I would have liked, but it paid. More importantly, it reminded me that I still had value, that I wasn't broken, just bruised. I worked obsessively. Nights, weekends. I treated that small project like it was the most important thing in the world, because in a way, it was. It was proof that I wasn't finished. During all of this, my parents barely checked in. When they did, it was surface level. Any updates? Still looking. My answers got shorter. Not out of bitterness, but because I was done narrating my struggle for people who only listened when it was convenient. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be thriving. Or at least performing thriving. New furniture. New plans. Photos sent to the family group chat of his new place, fully furnished thanks to my parents' generosity. They reacted with heart emojis and exclamation points. I muted the chat for a while. As weeks passed, that one freelance project turned into 2, then 3. Nothing stable yet, but momentum. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're too busy working to notice. I started waking up with purpose again. Not optimism. Purpose. There's a difference. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't checked my bank account obsessively in a few days. That realization hit me harder than any rejection email ever had. It meant I wasn't panicking every hour anymore. I was planning. I paid my landlord a partial amount and negotiated more time. It wasn't ideal, but it bought me space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to keep building. What surprised me most during that period wasn't the work. It was the emotional shift. Somewhere along the way, the hurt I'd been carrying about my parents started to change shape. It didn't disappear, but it sharpened, became more defined, less raw. I stopped wondering why they treated Mark differently and started accepting that they always had. That acceptance hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped trying to earn fairness. Stopped hoping that if I explained myself better, they'd finally see me. I began to understand that their version of me was fixed, reliable, resilient, low maintenance. The son who didn't need help because he never asked for it loudly enough. So I stopped asking. As my work picked up, I began to notice something else. A pattern I'd ignored for years. I'd been the quiet support system more often than I remembered, helping my parents with tech, reviewing documents, giving advice, stepping in whenever something needed to be handled calmly and competently. I'd done it without keeping score, because that's what you do when you assume mutual respect is a given. Now, with some distance, I could see it clearly. They didn't see my help as sacrifice. They saw it as baseline. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me strategic. By the third month, I wasn't back yet, but I wasn't drowning either. I had a rhythm, a growing client list, a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. I even started setting money aside again, small amounts at first, just to remind myself that forward movement was possible. My parents noticed the change before I said anything. My mom commented that I sounded better on the phone. My dad mentioned I seemed more confident. They didn't ask why. They didn't ask how. And that was fine, because by then, I wasn't rebuilding myself for them. I was rebuilding quietly, intentionally, with memory and clarity guiding every step. And all the while, in the back of my mind, sat that conversation from years ago. That promise, the one they'd assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. As my footing stabilized and my confidence returned, I began to understand that what I was building wasn't just financial security. It was leverage, independence that didn't require their approval, strength that didn't need their acknowledgement. I wasn't ready to act yet, not even close. But for the first time since losing my job, I could see a path forward that didn't end with me begging for scraps of validation. I wasn't at the top of the mountain, but I was no longer at the bottom. And the higher I climbed on my own, the clearer it became that the next phase wouldn't be about survival at all. It would be about choice. Once I stopped waking up in panic, once the fear of immediate collapse faded into something quieter and more manageable, my thoughts began to change in ways that surprised me. Not darker, clearer, focused. It's strange how stability doesn't make you forget what hurt you. It gives you the space to examine it properly. I didn't think of what I was doing as revenge at first. That word felt too loud, too emotional. What I was doing felt calmer than that. Colder, maybe. I started calling it preparation. The first thing I did was stop reacting. No more immediate replies to family messages. No more jumping in when my dad needed something real quick. No more filling silences with reassurance when my mom worried aloud about Mark's stress levels. I became pleasant, neutral, unavailable in small, deniable ways. Always polite, never confrontational, just busy. They didn't notice right away. They rarely did. What they did notice, eventually, was that I wasn't volunteering anymore. When the Wi-Fi went down at my parents' house and my dad texted asking if I could swing by, I told him I was tied up with work. When my mom asked if I could review a document for her friend, I said I'd look at it later and never followed up. When Mark asked if I could help him think through a decision, I told him I trusted his judgment. Each time, there was a pause on the other end. Confusion, mild annoyance, then acceptance. They'd always assumed my availability was permanent. Turns out, it wasn't. Around that same time, my work shifted again. One of the clients I'd been freelancing for asked if I could take on a bigger role. More responsibility. Longer term. It wasn't a full-time offer, but it was close enough to change how I plan my weeks. It came with more money, more visibility, and more say. I accepted without hesitation. With that came access. Meetings. Conversations. Decisions I hadn't been part of before. And with access comes information, whether you're looking for it or not. I started learning things. Not about my family at first, but about systems. How money moved. How decisions were justified. How narratives were shaped to make certain outcomes feel inevitable. I realized how often people with resources framed their choices as necessities rather than preferences. That realization circled back to my parents in a way I couldn't ignore. They hadn't helped Mark because they had to. They'd helped him because they wanted to. Because it fit the story they'd been telling themselves for years. Mark needed rescuing. I didn't. Understanding that stripped away the last layer of confusion I'd been clinging to. One evening, while organizing files for work, I came across an old folder I'd carried from computer to computer for years. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Inside were scanned documents, notes, emails, things I'd saved without fully understanding why at the time, just knowing they might matter someday. That was when I found it again. The thing that had stopped me cold back in my apartment weeks earlier. Years ago, when my parents were downsizing their finances, they'd asked for my help. Budget projections, account consolidation, long-term planning. They trusted me with it because I was good with details. Because I wouldn't panic. Because I wouldn't judge. During that process, my dad had made an offhand comment, half joking, half serious. "If anything ever happens to us," he'd said, "you're the one we trust to handle things." At the time, it sounded like responsibility, like respect, like something that meant I mattered. Later, there'd been more. Emails, notes, a drafted document that never became official but existed nonetheless. A contingency plan, a quiet acknowledgement that despite everything, I was the stable one. They'd assumed it was forgotten because it was never formalized, never discussed again. Life moved on. Mark's chaos took center stage. My reliability faded into the background. But records don't forget. I didn't smile when I found those files again. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. This wasn't about embarrassing them, or confronting them, or demanding apologies I knew would never come in the way I needed. This was about timing. From that point on, I started paying closer attention during family conversations. Not emotionally, practically. I noticed what they worried about, what they assumed was handled, what they deferred without thinking. My mom complained about paperwork piling up. My dad mentioned being overwhelmed with certain responsibilities. Mark talked openly about plans that depended heavily on continued financial support, as if it were guaranteed. No one asked me what I thought. That was fine. I also started reconnecting with people from my past. Quietly. Old co-workers who'd moved into roles with influence. Friends who'd started businesses. Contacts I'd let drift when I was too busy trying to prove I could do everything on my own. I didn't tell them about my family. I didn't vent. I talked about work, ideas, opportunities. I listened more than I spoke. One conversation led to another. One favor turned into collaboration. Slowly, intentionally, my network expanded in directions I hadn't anticipated before losing my job. And with every step forward, I felt something else building alongside it. Distance. The emotional kind. I stopped craving my parents' approval. Stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I should have said something differently. Their choices became data points instead of wounds. That's when I knew I was ready, not to act yet, but to position myself. The opportunity I'd been waiting for didn't announce itself dramatically. It came disguised as a problem. My dad called one evening, voice tense. He said he needed advice. Something about restructuring assets. Nothing urgent, but important. He asked if I had time to talk. I looked at my calendar, at the work I'd built, at the stability I'd earned on my own. "I can make time," I said. As he spoke, explaining the situation, I felt the full weight of what he was asking without realizing it. He trusted me. Still, enough to lean on me when things felt uncertain. What he didn't know was that I was listening differently now. Not as the son hoping to be seen, but as someone evaluating leverage. By the time the call ended, I knew exactly what my next steps would be. Not immediately, not recklessly, carefully, because the most effective setups don't look like threats. They look like help. The moment I knew it was time didn't come with anger or adrenaline. It came with paperwork. My dad asked me to come by on a Saturday morning. He framed it like a favor, the way he always did when he didn't want to sound like he was asking for help. He said he needed a second set of eyes on some documents. Asset reorganization. Nothing dramatic. Just making things cleaner for the future. I remember driving over and feeling almost calm. Not numb. Calm. The kind that comes when you've already made peace with what you're about to do. My parents' house looked the same as it always had. Same driveway. Same creaky front step. Same framed photos on the wall. All milestones and smiles, and carefully cropped moments that never showed tension. Mark's picture was newer than mine. Bigger frame. I noticed that without emotion, like noting the weather. We sat at the dining table. Papers spread out neatly. My dad talked. My mom hovered, chiming in when she felt something needed smoothing over. They were stressed, but not panicked. They still assumed things were under control. They assumed I was under control. As I read through the documents, everything I'd suspected was confirmed. The structure they'd built relied heavily on one assumption, that I would continue to be the quiet, competent backstop, the one who understood the details, the one who could be counted on to step in if something went wrong, the one who wouldn't rock the boat. They had leaned on that assumption for years without ever acknowledging it. I set the papers down and looked up. "There's a risk here," I said, keeping my voice neutral. My dad frowned. "What kind of risk?" "The kind that happens when responsibilities aren't clearly defined," I replied. "You're assuming someone will handle certain things automatically." My mom nodded. "That's why we wanted your input." That was my opening. Not the explosive kind. The quiet one. I'm happy to give input, I said. But I won't be the fallback anymore. The room went still. My dad blinked. What do you mean? I said calmly. I've been filling that role without it ever being formalized, acknowledged, or supported. And I'm done doing that. My mom laughed nervously. Brian, this isn't the time for. It is, I interrupted gently. Because this setup depends on it. They looked confused. Slightly offended. Like I'd broken an unspoken rule. My dad straightened. You're overthinking this. You've always helped. We trust you. I nodded. You trust me to handle things. You don't support me when I need help. Mark chose that moment to walk in from the kitchen, coffee in hand, oblivious. What's going on? My dad waved him off. Just logistics. I looked at Mark. Really looked at him. Relaxed. Unworried. Still insulated by choices that were never his alone. I'm stepping back, I said, louder now so everyone heard. From all of it. My mom's smile faded. Stepping back how? I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies. Emails. Notes. The old draft. The contingency language my dad had once joked about and never finalized. Alongside it, a summary I'd prepared outlining exactly how much of their system depended on my unpaid, unacknowledged involvement. I'm not listed anywhere officially, I continued, which means I'm not obligated to continue informally. My dad's face changed then. Not anger. Concern. You wouldn't just walk away, he said. That would put us in a difficult position. I held his gaze. You put me in a difficult position. Repeatedly. Silence settled heavy and uncomfortable. My mom tried again, softer. We didn't know it was that bad for you. I nodded. I told you when it mattered. You chose not to hear it. Mark shifted uncomfortably. This feels extreme, he muttered. I looked at him. So did watching you get 6 months of rent paid while I was facing eviction. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, there was nothing rehearsed to say. I stood up. I'm not asking for anything, I said. No money. No apologies. I'm just informing you that starting now, I'm not the safety net anymore. You'll need to formalize responsibilities or hire professionals. I won't be involved unless there's mutual respect and clear boundaries. My dad's voice was tight. You're doing this because you're angry. No, I replied. I'm doing this because I bounced back. And I finally see my worth. I left then. No shouting. No slammed doors. The fallout didn't hit immediately. It crept in. Within weeks, things started slipping. Tasks went undone. Decisions stalled. Professionals cost money and asked questions my parents weren't used to answering. The convenience they'd taken for granted vanished. They called. I didn't rush to answer. When I did, I was polite, brief, unavailable. Mark struggled more than anyone. Without my quiet guidance, his plans unraveled faster. He asked for advice. I told him to trust his judgment, just like he'd once told me. My parents tried a different approach then. Guilt, concern, long talks about family and sacrifice. I listened. I didn't bend. The real reckoning came months later at another family gathering. Smaller this time. Tense. My dad pulled me aside. You've changed, he said. Yes, I agreed. You used to be dependable. I still am, I replied. Just not for people who depend on me without supporting me. He looked tired. Older than I remembered. My mom joined us, eyes glossy. We didn't realize how much we leaned on you. I nodded. That's the problem. There was no dramatic apology. No tearful confession. Just acknowledgement. Too late to undo the past, but enough to change the future. Mark avoided my eyes the rest of the evening. I didn't feel victorious driving home. I felt steady. In the months that followed, my work solidified into something permanent. Better than what I'd lost. I moved to a new place. Smaller, but mine. Built entirely on my own terms. My parents adjusted. They had to. The family dynamic shifted permanently. Less comfortable. More honest. And me? I stopped shrinking myself to make others comfortable. I didn't win money. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I did something better. I removed myself as the invisible support holding up a system that never valued me. They learned what I was worth the moment I stopped giving it away. And the funny thing is, I really did bounce back. Just not in the way they expected.